Hi guys, welcome to Book Time. My name is Julia. I'm filming in my car today because it's very hot. It's 36 degrees and actually that's like a terrible reason why I'm in my car. I'm in my car because I had to drive around to get my baby to sleep on my way to a girlfriend's house. So I'm at her house now, but he's still asleep back there. So he's probably only going to sleep for maybe 10 more minutes. So I'm going to try and finish this video or else record some of it now and some of it later because I've tried about 10,000 times to record this. I always get interrupted, so I'm just going to do it in the car. So the video is going to be a little review on Three Women by Lisa Taddeo, which I just finished. And I'm making a video about this because, as everyone knows, it's been quite controversial and people tend to either love it or hate it. I am in the didn't love it camp, and I just kind of wanted to talk through the reasons why. I mean, I know it's kind of been done to death, and Sarah from Hardcover Hearts actually did a really good video on it about the elements of the book she found very frustrating, and then she directed viewers to some books that she thought did a better job of what this book was trying to do, which is write a book about female desire. So the book, Lisa Taddeo sets up the book as being sort of an account of female desire told through the lives of three women. It took her 8 years or something to research, and that's sort of made out to be a big deal. Like, it's 8 years worth of journalism, like investigative journalism, and this is the sort of resulting reportage. And in the foreword or the introduction, she sort of talks about how it's all totally pieced together from interviews with the subjects, as well as like court transcripts, and other text messages, emails, things like that. And so there's this idea that it's very true from these women's perspective, the stories they're telling. She also talks about how these three women's stories are sort of indicative of some universal truths about longing and desire, and she even mentions about how it's sort of how they're emblematic of this idea of longing in America. So she makes some pretty big claims about the universality of the feelings and experiences of these women. Now, I don't want to say anything to take away from the stories of the three women. There's Maggie Wilkin, who is a real person. Oh, they're all real people. Sorry, Maggie is her real name. And when she was a teenager, she had an affair with one of her teachers, and that has been documented publicly through the court system because she sued him a few years later as an adult. So one is her story of that affair and her perspective, which did not get seen in the media at the time. The media was very focused on the man. The second one is a woman called Lena. That is a pseudonym, and it's about her separating from her husband and then having an affair with another married man who she's known since high school. The third one is about a woman called Sloane, who I'm not sure if she's bisexual, but she's married to a man and she does sleep with men and women outside of that relationship. And sorry if it's very noisy, it's so windy here today, and I also have the air conditioning on, so I can't tell if there's a lot of background noise. So Sloane's husband likes watching her sleep with other people. So it's essentially an account of their sex lives and quite a close retelling of these three particular experiences. Now, Lisa Taddeo does not offer any analysis not much analysis of these three scenarios. She basically sort of presents them, like just tells us the story, and to me it seems like what she's saying is these stories are enough. You should be able to draw the truth, like the truths in these stories should be self-evident. She doesn't make or draw any particularly big conclusions from them. As an author or a narrator or a journalist, she sort of tells the stories, and the implication seems to be you can draw the meaning for yourself. It should be obvious and self-evident. To me, the thread drawing all these stories together was the fact that patriarchy and the sexist society in which we live shapes female desire into something that means we want all these things, that women want these things. And when I say women, I should mention, I mean white, middle to upper class women. so reasonably privileged and well off, and mostly straight. So I think Sloane is the only woman who, she might be bisexual, but she's certainly married to a man. So it's unclear whether, it's sort of unclear what her sexuality is like, but they're reasonably normative, cisgendered women, and quite privileged. So it kind of speaks to how that type of woman, its desire is shaped into something that means we, and when I say we, I'm including myself because I'm part of that category, will never get what we want, which is basically a reciprocal relationship. This is what I'm saying the book kind of says, that women want a reciprocal sort of loving relationship where they get to have good sex with someone they love. Doesn't sound that revolutionary. However, the way that they want it and the way the men sort of get to deliver it means that the women never get really what they want and the men do. Not making this very clear. Basically, it's like the women are set up to fail, but the men get to have what they want, which is sex whenever they want it. That's kind of the general gist that I drew from the stories. Which, you know, is correct and can be interesting, but I feel like it's not that original, maybe. And I feel like one of the big problems is the framing of this book. And look, a lot of people have said it. Jacqueline said it. Sarah said it. I know other people have said it too. I'll link their videos on it below. This is not a story about American longing. This is like 3 case studies of 3 white women who have particular instances of longing and desire that gets quashed by the sexist society in which we live. And that analysis, I think, would have been a lot more interesting had Lisa Taddeo delved into it. I think what also would have been more interesting is, of course, if she had included women from other demographics and broadened the diversity of her subjects. Now, Sarah was saying that she went and saw Lisa Taddeo at an event, and she had said that the reason she chose these subjects was she actually did have a broader pool of subjects, I think 10 or 11. But these 3 were the only women who basically provided enough information for her to make a book out of. And so Sarah made the good point that it wasn't as though she did this huge amount of research and then the research led her to the fact that these stories were the most relevant or emblematic. It's simply that they were the only material she had. So the fact that she's saying, well, this was the only material I ended up having, and then drawing universal conclusions from it, is quite problematic. To me, it would have been more interesting and more honest, I suppose, if she'd said, look, these are 3 case studies. Here are some interesting insights we can maybe draw from it, and these are the limitations of the scope of my study. But she didn't say any of that stuff, which is problematic because it contributes kind of to the problem it's trying to address, which is the problem of sexism, of which all women suffer, but obviously white middle-class women suffer the least out of, you know, as much as women of colour or lower class women, or, you know, the intersection of all these different factors that mean that like many groups of women are more disadvantaged than others in different ways. So it didn't really address the intersectionality of female oppression particularly well, and didn't deal with like trans women or anything like that. So they were some of the problems. My other main problem, which contributed to that issue, the problem of her universal conclusions, was her style of reportage. Now, I am all for interesting and experimental forms of writing, particularly non-fiction writing and reportage, journalism, but the way Lisa Taddeo did it was she kind of collapsed any distance between herself as the journalist or the narrator, the writer of these stories, and the actual subjects themselves. So I think when you are writing non-fiction about other people, you always have to be aware of your own position and what you bring as an individual who is a result of all the influences and people and the environments in which you've spent your own life, and the impact of all that on the stories that you're telling, the way it influences, you know, the way it gives you particular biases that you might not know what those biases are, but you have to acknowledge that you have them and you come from a particular position, and that's going to affect the way you interpret and understand other people's stories and decide which information is the most important bit to tell. Like, whether you like it or not, that's a fact. So the fact she doesn't do that, the way she actually narrates the story is from the women's perspective. So it's mostly told in the third person, but it's told sort of like from each individual woman's point of view. And she says in the intro that she's going to do that. And I think that's a sort of political choice to sort of say, I want to immerse you in the experiences of these women so that you can hear their stories. But the problem is, half the time you're like, is this the woman? Like, how did she get this information? Did she get it from an email? Did the woman tell her? Or is it just her interpretation of it? It's very unclear. And so sometimes it reads like fiction. Because there seems to be like this such an inhabiting of her subjects' minds. Sure, that could be testament to her skill as an interviewer and journalist and writer. But to me, it actually creates a problem, because I'm like, well, you are writing about other people, and now I don't know which bits are you or which bits are them. And even though maybe you can't separate that when you are the journalist, you don't even acknowledge that that is something to keep in mind while we're reading in any shape or form. Like, she barely ever quotes the sources she's talking about. Like, occasionally she'll be like, oh, and once Maggie said this in a deposition. And you're like, it kind of throws you out of the story, because you're like, oh yeah, this is a reporter like piecing together information rather than just telling a story. So I found that problematic, because I feel like that also detracted, like, if her point was to tell these women's stories as truthfully as possible, for me, that collapsed distance between herself as the narrator and the subjects actually, like, lessened the authenticity of the stories, I suppose, because it didn't acknowledge the limitations. It sort of assumed that you really could immerse yourself in this kind of third-hand narrative, if that made sense. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that was probably one of the main frustrations I had with it. One of Sarah's other frustrations, which I found really interesting, was that she talked about how the novel contained all this really triggering, and there's like some hardcore abuse and mistreatment going on in this story. In the 3 stories told by the women. And a lot of manipulation and coercion, particularly in Maggie's one. She's the one who had an affair with her teacher, obviously, because he's an adult and she is not. And it didn't bother me so much that there wasn't a content warning. Maybe that's because I went into this book knowing it was already going to include a lot of pretty intense stuff, because I'd already heard a lot of reviews. But Sarah's point was valid, that because the book hadn't been marketed like that, it had been sort of marketed as this titillating book on desire, you don't go in expecting it, and it's quite confronting and problematic that it's so confronting without a content warning. But yeah, I guess my problem was that all this confronting information was presented, and again, the assumption that presenting it means whatever truths the author wants us to draw from it are self-evident. That was a problem for me. Like, to me, there needed to be just more analysis, more explanation of, like, this is a problem because of A, B, C, D. Because not everyone understands structural sexism. Not everyone understands that women aren't asking for it all the time. Not everyone understands that why statutory rape is bad, and that's why it happens. Or that's why men get away with it, because they don't really believe it's that bad, because they believe they're entitled to it. So I just feel like there could have been a little bit more analysis. I mean, all the things I'm saying aren't very groundbreaking. I suppose that was my other problem, is I'm like, okay, the obvious conclusions to draw from this aren't that groundbreaking. To me, what would have been more interesting is, like, why did 2 women want to be anonymous? Why did the other 9 people who you began interviewing decide to hold back in the end? Like, what are those pressures? What are those constraints that are stopping women from telling their stories? To me, that would have been a reflection on that would have been more interesting. Like, I feel like the stories themselves that Lisa Taddeo told probably could have been cut down, because there was a lot of description and scene setting and stuff, which I think was designed to make it feel realistic and relatable. But in the end, I was like, okay, I actually want more of your thoughts on this, like more commentary, because as standalone stories, I'm like, it's great that these women get to tell their stories, but it's like, if you want to contribute to the conversation and move it forward, you as the narrator, as the investigative reporter, need to do something with them. that was my view. I mean, I do believe in the power of simply like women having a voice, but interestingly at the very end, I have my book here, so I'm going to look up the quotation. And look, she did do a little bit of analysis at the very end, but it was like just a few pages. And I was like, this is the most interesting bit. This should have been woven in. Oh, the baby's awake. I don't know if you can hear him making funny noises. I'm going to finish this video. I'm going to finish it. Oh, baby, no, 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 don't cry. Basically, I can't find it, but in the last few pages, she says something like, you know, it's really important to tell women's stories because so far the only women's stories who get heard are those who actively make space for themselves, or it's white women or privileged women, and, you know, it's important to hear other voices too. And I was like, but they're the only voices that you've shared, which is great. Like, I'm not saying that those voices shouldn't be shared, but like, you yourself have placed this responsibility and importance on the sharing of stories, and you're not doing enough with the stories you've been given. To me, that was my problem, as well as the framing was poor and the style of reportage detracted and undermined her purpose of sharing the stories of these women. That's all I have to say. I'm going to go now, tend to my baby, and I'm going to upload this from my phone because otherwise it will never get done. All right, bye guys.